What if the city that was once described as the beating heart of the modern world is now the clearest warning sign that something deeper is breaking in America? What if returning to New York no longer feels like stepping into possibility, but rather stepping into a pressure cooker of noise, decay, and exhaustion that no one wants to admit is happening? The question is simple but uncomfortable. Why are so many travelers, workers, and even longtime residents saying they will never come back unless they enjoy living on the edge of chaos itself? For generations, New York sold the dream of energy, opportunity, and cultural brilliance. But today, crossing its avenues feels less like entering a global capital and more like walking through a city stretched to its limit. The streets crowd with frustration you can feel in the air, the kind that tells you this place is running hotter than it can sustain. Visitors describe the shock instantly. The noise hits first, then the density, then the subtle realization that the city no longer has the balance it once had. It is as if every system, from public transport to street management, is fighting to keep up with the weight of millions. And behind every honking car, every overflowing trash can, every person rushing with clenched teeth, lies a truth few want to say out loud. The illusion that New York can handle anything is fading. You can sense it in the subway platforms that vibrate with anxiety rather than anticipation. You can sense it in tourists who arrive excited and leave exhausted, wondering how a city so powerful can feel so unprotected and unpredictable. The city that symbolized control and ambition now feels like a test of endurance, and that shift is not an accident. It is the result of years of rising costs, shrinking services, and mounting urban pressures colliding at once. People still come for the landmarks, the lights, the idea of New York, but the moment the spell wears off, the reality hits hard. The chaos is no longer charming, it is constant, and it leaves a mark. Have you ever felt that strange mix of excitement and unease when walking through a place that seems bigger than itself? That sensation is becoming the new normal in New York, and it is quietly pushing people away. Before you dive deeper into this, take a moment and share your experience. Have you ever visited a city that made you question whether the dream matched the reality? Your comment helps this channel grow and helps others understand what is happening out there. And if this opening already made you reflect, hit the like button and check if you are subscribed. What comes next may change the way you see not just New York, but the future of every major city built on the promise of endless momentum. The moment that first spark of excitement fades, something more revealing begins to surface. The image of New York as the ultimate symbol of progress starts to collide with the reality unfolding at street level, and it becomes clear why so many people walk away feeling that the city is no longer what it claims to be. The myth of endless opportunity, of a place that rewards ambition and reinvents itself every decade, now competes with an atmosphere that feels heavier, slower, and strangely drained. Visitors who once stepped into the city expecting inspiration frequently describe something closer to disorientation. The pace is still fast, but the purpose behind it feels blurred, as if the city is running out of the fuel that once made it magnetic. For decades, New York thrived on the idea that anything could happen here. That belief created a cultural force so strong that millions accepted the high prices, the crowds, the stress, because the reward was belonging to a story bigger than themselves. Now that story feels fractured. Neighborhoods once known for creativity feel sanitized. Cultural icons replaced by commercial chains. Spaces that used to hold a sense of identity now feel like copy-pasted fragments of a global mall. Even longtime residents admit that the city feels more commercial than cultural, more transactional than expressive. The grit that once defined New York was never just aesthetic. It was part of its resilience. Losing it means losing part of its soul. Travelers who return after years away often say the change is jarring. Instead of discovering a city evolving with purpose, they find a city struggling to balance who it was with what it is becoming. The streets feel busier but less vibrant. The energy is still there, but it feels thinner, stretched across too many responsibilities, too many pressures, too many contradictory expectations. The promise of prosperity that once made the chaos worth it now feels out of reach for most people who pass through. Even those who arrive eager to absorb the culture quickly realize that the magic is no longer effortless. It is something you have to search for beneath layers of inconvenience and fatigue. What unsettles many visitors is not that New York has changed, but that it seems unaware of how much it has changed. The symbols remain the same, yet the experience around them has shifted. Times Square glows brighter than ever, but few linger long enough to enjoy it. Brooklyn still markets itself as creative, but rising costs push out the very communities that once gave it identity. The museums, theaters, and cultural venues remain world-class, but the streets surrounding them feel more chaotic, as if the city can no longer support the weight of the expectations placed upon it. And that disconnect between image and experience is what quietly erodes loyalty. When the fantasy no longer aligns with reality, people start looking elsewhere for what New York used to offer. As more visitors walk away feeling that the city has lost the balance between inspiration and exhaustion, a new question begins to form. If the fantasy that sustained New York for so long is fading, what does that mean for the millions who still dream of it from afar, and for the industries that depended on that dream to keep the city alive? As people begin to sense that the city they expected is not the city they encounter, the next shock comes fast and without disguise. It hits at the moment they try to buy a coffee, pay for a ride, book a room, or simply access what used to be a basic experience of being in New York. The numbers no longer make sense, not even for those who plan their trip with generous budgets. Visitors talk about it constantly, and residents feel it even more intensely. The city has crossed a threshold where the cost of existing has become disproportionate to what it offers, turning every simple action into a calculation, every pleasure into a negotiation, and every necessity into a burden. You start to notice it in the smallest gestures. A breakfast that used to be casual now feels like a luxury. A hotel room that once represented comfort now comes with a price tag that rivals destinations far more refined. Transportation, whether through taxis, ride apps, or the subway, feels like navigating a system that charges more yet delivers less. Even public spaces seem to demand financial sacrifice, as if the entire city has been designed to extract maximum value from anyone who steps into it. The financial pressure builds day after day, and for many visitors, it becomes the moment they realize they do not want to return. Residents speak about an economy that seems disconnected from reality, where everyday essentials cost what used to be considered indulgences. Restaurants add fees for everything from service to space to convenience. Hotels add surcharges that multiply the final bill beyond anything predictable. Attractions charge premium rates for standard experiences. The entire system appears built on the assumption that people will keep paying simply because it is New York, but that assumption is losing strength. When a city depends more on its reputation than on the value it delivers, a silent decline begins to spread through every part of its infrastructure. Tourists expecting a trip filled with cultural richness quickly learn that accessing that richness requires navigating an endless maze of expenses. Each activity feels like stepping through a checkpoint. Each decision highlights the imbalance between cost and satisfaction. Families talk about the strain of planning a simple day out. Couples feel the frustration of paying premium prices for services that fail to justify the investment. Solo travelers grow defensive, trying to protect their budgets from the constant pressure the city imposes, and after a few days, the emotional effect sets in. The joy of discovery turns into a kind of economic fatigue. The city that once symbolized ambition now feels like a test of financial endurance, and that shift leaves a lasting impression. When people leave, they are not only carrying the memory of overstimulated streets or crowded subways. They are carrying the weight of knowing that the economic reality of New York no longer aligns with what it promises. And once that thought settles, it changes the relationship people have with the city entirely. The question becomes not whether New York is worth visiting, but whether the experience justifies what it takes from you in return. As the financial strain settles in, something even more visceral begins to shape the experience of those who walk through New York today. It is not just the cost of being in the city that unsettles people. It is the environment itself, the physical and sensory overload that feels more aggressive than energizing. You start noticing it long before you articulate it. A certain heaviness in the air, a tension that travels through the sidewalks, a sense that the city is operating at a pace its infrastructure can no longer support. What once felt like intensity now feels like deterioration, and the signs are not subtle. The streets carry layers of noise that never truly stop. It is not just traffic or crowds, but a chaotic mixture of constant construction, impatient horns, engines straining against clogged avenues, and voices trying to cut through a volume that never lowers. People visiting for the first time often describe the noise as something physical, pressing against their minds, wearing them down hour after hour. And yet the noise is only the beginning. The visual overload adds another dimension. Overflowing trash bags stacked along entire blocks, sidewalks, stained and cracked, public bins filled beyond capacity, and the unmistakable smell that drifts from the corners where the city hesitates to look at itself. The subway amplifies this feeling. The platforms vibrate under the weight of outdated trains. The ceilings drip, the walls crack, and the temperature swings between suffocating heat and uncomfortable chill. Moments that should feel routine instead carry an underlying stress. People stand closer than they want to, eyes wide, shoulders tense, as if waiting for something unpredictable to happen. Visitors expecting an iconic transit system walk away stunned by how fragile it feels. They describe delays that stretch endlessly, sudden evacuations, malfunctioning doors, and a level of disorder that leaves them wondering how a city with such global importance allows its core to operate in such conditions. Above ground, the sidewalks feel overcrowded, yet simultaneously unmanaged. Cyclists weaving through pedestrians, delivery workers, racing against impossible schedules, cars pushing aggressively through intersections, all while tourists try to orient themselves without becoming part of the collision. It creates a strange sensation, as if the city is moving faster than its own structure, forcing everyone to adjust to a rhythm that punishes hesitation. And beneath this movement lies a subtle but powerful emotion: fatigue. Not the normal fatigue of a busy day, but the fatigue of a place that demands too much while giving too little calm in return. People who once dreamed of experiencing New York describe the shock of realizing how physically overwhelming it can be. They talk about needing long, quiet moments upon returning home, about how the sensory impact lingered long after the trip ended. And residents, even those who love the city, admit that something has changed in the way the streets feel. The deterioration is no longer hidden. It is visible, audible, and unavoidable, shaping the emotional landscape of everyone who passes through. If you have ever walked through a place that felt like it was pushing back against you, share what it was like. Your perspective can help others understand how environments shape the way we experience a city. As the physical pressure of the city settles into the mind of anyone moving through its streets, another realization rises quietly in the background. It becomes clear the moment visitors compare what they are paying with what they are receiving. New York, which once delivered unforgettable experiences almost effortlessly, now feels like a place where the exchange is unbalanced. The tourism industry, long considered one of the city's strongest pillars, increasingly operates on the assumption that people will tolerate anything, as long as they can say they were here. But that assumption is beginning to crack, and the disappointment surfaces in small, honest moments. Travelers describe hotel stays that feel less like hospitality and more like transactions. Rooms that cost the price of luxury but offer the simplicity of budget accommodations. Services trimmed, staff overwhelmed, maintenance delayed. Some hotels preserve the facade of elegance, but behind the polished lobby floors, the strain is visible. Long waits, sudden extra fees, and a sense that the experience is standardized rather than special. Guests leave wondering why they paid so much for so little, and that question lingers far longer than the trip itself. Restaurants and cafes follow a similar pattern. What used to be a world-class food scene has been stretched thin by high turnover, overwhelming demand, and a cost structure that punishes consistency. Visitors sit down expecting exceptional meals and instead encounter rushed service, inflated prices, and dishes that fail to match the reputation. For many, the shock is not the cost, but the lack of value behind it. The sense of discovery that once defined eating in New York now competes with the frustration of knowing that better experiences exist elsewhere for a fraction of the price. Even the city's most iconic attractions show signs of strain. Long lines stretch across blocks, even for simple exhibits. Museums, once sanctuaries of calm reflection, feel packed to capacity regardless of the day or season. Observation decks designed to inspire awe can feel crowded and hurried, giving visitors only seconds to absorb the view before being pushed along. Broadway tickets cost more than ever, yet the surrounding environment, from the streets to the theaters themselves, feels more chaotic and less welcoming. The transportation system, which should make exploring the city easier, often produces the opposite effect. Tourists who planned itineraries around subway routes find themselves delayed by service changes, unexpected closures, and unpredictable schedules. Those who rely on rideshare apps encounter steep surge prices, long wait times, and traffic so dense that short distances turn into exhausting journeys. The movement between attractions becomes a source of stress rather than excitement, and that slowly erodes the joy of experiencing the city. What makes all of this so impactful is not the individual inconveniences, but how they accumulate. Each small disappointment stacks on top of the last one, reshaping the memory of the trip. By the time visitors return home, they describe an experience defined not by the magic New York once guaranteed, but by a feeling that something essential has slipped away. And once that feeling settles, it becomes difficult to imagine returning, no matter how iconic the city remains in the world's imagination. As visitors try to process the imbalance between what they expected and what they found, another layer of discomfort begins to surface, one that has nothing to do with prices, lines, hotels, or transportation. It comes from observing the people who live in New York every day, navigating a social landscape marked by contradictions so sharp that even outsiders can feel the tension in the air. The city has always been a place of extremes, but recently those extremes have grown so pronounced that they define the experience more than the attractions themselves. The distance between wealth and poverty has widened to the point where both realities exist side by side with almost no interaction, and that contrast creates an atmosphere that is difficult to ignore. You see it in the way luxury storefronts stand only a few steps away from people, struggling visibly, both occupying the same sidewalk yet living in different worlds. Visitors often describe a strange emotional conflict when walking through these spaces, as if the city is trying to project prosperity while simultaneously revealing the fragile structure beneath it. The glamorous image long associated with certain neighborhoods now feels like a thin layer placed over unresolved issues. People who arrive expecting a cinematic urban experience quickly realize that what they are seeing is far more complex and far heavier than the version presented in advertising or entertainment. The sense of social instability grows with every corner turned. Groups of people sleep near buildings that once symbolized power. Individuals struggling with mental illness walk through crowded areas unnoticed, their pain blending into the motion of the city. Tourists trying to enjoy their surroundings often feel a mix of sympathy, confusion, and unease, not because they expect perfection, but because the imbalance feels so pronounced that it shapes the entire atmosphere. The city no longer hides its fractures. They are visible in daylight, in public spaces, in the expressions of those who have clearly been worn down by the weight of surviving here. Even spaces meant to offer comfort or leisure reflect the strain. Parks feel more crowded, not with people relaxing, but with individuals seeking a moment of relief from conditions that seem impossible to escape. Subway cars fill with performances, pleas, arguments, and silence heavy enough to make even short rides emotionally demanding. Visitors describe a subtle fear that comes not from danger itself but from unpredictability. The behaviors they witness are often not malicious, but signs of a system stretched past its limit, where too many people are left to manage their struggles in public view. What impacts visitors most is not judgment, but exhaustion. They arrive wanting to explore but soon find themselves absorbing the emotional weight of the city without meaning to. The constant exposure to hardship creates a kind of mental pressure. A reminder that beneath the towering buildings and famous landmarks lies a population fighting battles that outsiders cannot fully understand. And that awareness, repeated moment after moment, begins to reshape how they perceive the city as a whole. Many leave with a sense that the social fabric of the place is fraying, and that this fraying affects not just residents, but everyone who steps into the environment. The energy that once made the city feel alive now coexists with an undercurrent of instability, creating an experience that feels intense in ways no one anticipates. And once that realization settles in, it becomes part of the memory people carry long after they leave, influencing their desire to return and altering the way they think about what a global city is supposed to be. As the emotional weight of the city settles into the mind of anyone passing through, something deeper begins to unfold, something that goes beyond infrastructure and beyond economics. It is a feeling that grows slowly, almost unnoticeably at first, until it becomes impossible to ignore. People describe it as a type of mental exhaustion that does not come from walking long distances or dealing with crowds, but from being immersed in an environment that asks for constant alertness. The city does not just move quickly. It demands attention at every second, pulling energy from anyone who tries to navigate its rhythm. The bright lights that once symbolized possibility now seem to flicker with an intensity that leaves visitors drained rather than inspired. What many travelers do not expect is how quickly this emotional fatigue sets in. They arrive excited, ready to absorb everything at once, but soon find themselves overwhelmed by a sense of pressure that does not ease. The density, the noise, the unpredictability, the social contrasts, all combine to create an atmosphere that feels as if the city is always pressing forward, never pausing, never offering a moment to breathe. Even when standing still, people feel the anticipation, as though the environment itself is on edge, ready to pull them into movement again. It creates an emotional tension that builds steadily, and by the end of the day, visitors are surprised by how deeply it has affected them. The most striking part of this exhaustion is that it does not come from any single source. It comes from the constant layering of stimuli that never slow down. A street filled with rushing crowds. A train car echoing with conflicting emotions. A sudden shout from someone struggling silently moments before. A tourist trying to enjoy a landmark surrounded by people whose stress radiates into the space. Every moment carries a trace of urgency. Even the simple act of crossing the street becomes part of a system that pushes everyone into a rhythm they did not choose. There is little room for softness, little room for accidental quiet, and that absence shapes the experience more than any skyline or attraction ever could. You see it in the way people walk, shoulders tight, eyes scanning, expressions carrying fatigue even early in the morning. Visitors often talk about feeling as though they are being pulled into a current they cannot control. They want to slow down, but the environment does not allow it. The effort to keep up becomes emotional labor, and this labor accumulates. Body can recover from a long day, but the mind absorbs the tension until it begins to reshape how the city feels. The excitement fades, replaced by a sense that the place is taking more energy than it gives back. And when that moment arrives, when the emotional cost becomes clearer than the thrill, people start noticing things they had overlooked before. The small conflicts on the sidewalk, the frustration in a stranger's voice, the exhaustion in the faces around them. It becomes obvious that the environment is wearing down not only visitors, but the people who live here every day. And that realization changes everything. The city no longer feels like a destination. It feels like a force, one that pushes and pulls until you are not sure whether you are navigating it, or it is navigating you. If you have ever visited a place that left you emotionally drained without you noticing it at first, share what that experience was like. Your perspective helps expand this conversation and brings depth to what we are exploring here. As the emotional fatigue settles in, something else begins to stand out to anyone paying attention. It is not loud or dramatic, but it is unmistakable. It comes from the way people talk after leaving the city, from the things they choose not to revisit, from the hesitation in their voices when someone asks if they would return. There is a subtle shift happening, a pattern forming quietly across conversations, reviews, travel plans, and the decisions of those who once saw the city as an essential stop. It is the slow, steady movement of people deciding not to come back. Not because of one specific issue, but because of the cumulative weight of everything they experienced. This shift is not tied to fear or hostility. It is tied to exhaustion. Visitors start to realize that the energy they spent trying to navigate the intensity of the city did not come back to them in the form of inspiration or wonder. Instead, it left them drained. They return home and notice how their bodies relax, how their minds settle, how silence feels unfamiliar for a moment before becoming comforting again. And at some point during that recovery, the thought emerges quietly. Maybe once was enough. People who used to romanticize the city now talk about how overwhelming it felt. They describe moments when they tried to enjoy the experience, but found themselves distracted by the constant pressure of the environment. They admit that the stress lingered longer than the excitement, and that the memories they carry are mixed with a sense of relief that the trip eventually ended. Even those who once dreamed of returning year after year begin reconsidering their plans, drifting toward destinations that promise beauty without requiring a constant fight for space, calm, or clarity. This sentiment extends beyond tourists. Former residents tell similar stories, explaining how they reached the point where the pace of daily life no longer aligned with their emotional capacity, they describe the decision to leave as both difficult and inevitable. When they talk about it now, they speak with a clarity that surprises them. Not because they dislike the city, but because they recognize what it cost them to live there. They talk about sleeping better, thinking more clearly, feeling less pressured, and realizing only after leaving how tightly they had been holding themselves together. There is also a growing awareness that the city is no longer the irreplaceable cultural nucleus it once was. People are discovering new global centers that offer innovation, art, cuisine, architecture, and experiences with far less strain. Cities across Europe, Asia, and even smaller destinations in North America now compete effortlessly with what used to make this place special. Remote work, shifting cultural priorities, and new expectations about quality of life have reshaped how travelers choose where to go. The once automatic decision to visit or revisit is now being reconsidered in light of global options that feel more balanced and inviting. What makes this movement significant is not the number of people leaving or choosing not to return, but the reasons behind it. They are not driven by sudden crises or isolated events. They are driven by a quiet, consistent feeling that grows stronger with each trip, each memory, each comparison. A realization that the city demands more than it gives, that the cost of engagement has climbed while the rewards have diminished. And once that understanding settles in, it becomes a turning point in how people decide where to invest their time, their energy, and their sense of wonder. As people quietly decide not to return, a deeper question begins to take shape, one that goes beyond travel preferences or personal discomfort. It touches the very identity of a place that once believed itself immune to decline. The city has long relied on a myth that almost everyone accepted without resistance, the idea that it is the center of the world, the cultural and economic engine that sets the tone for global life. For decades, that belief seemed unshakable, reinforced by the skyline, the media presence, the influence on finance and fashion and art. But when you strip away the narrative and look at the lived experience unfolding on the ground, it becomes clear that the identity the city projects is no longer the identity people feel when they walk through it. This mismatch reveals something fragile. Cities are built not only with steel and concrete, but with meaning. Their power comes from what people believe they represent. And when the experience no longer aligns with the myth begins to unravel. Visitors expect innovation, brilliance, cultural depth, a level of excellence that once defined a place effortlessly. What they increasingly encounter instead is a city fighting to keep up with its own reputation. The infrastructure struggles, the social pressure is visible. The energy feels unstable rather than magnetic. The identity that once felt solid now appears stretched thin, holding onto a past that is harder to sustain with each passing year. People who once admired the city from afar now describe it with a different vocabulary. They say it feels tired. They say it feels reactive rather than visionary. They say the ambition that once shaped entire industries has been replaced by a kind of heavy inertia. Even the iconic symbols lose part of their impact when the environment surrounding them feels worn down. The skyline still rises with dramatic confidence, but what happens in the streets below determines how people interpret that confidence. And lately, the interpretation has shifted towards something more uncertain. The cultural influence that once radiated outward is facing new competition from places that evolved more fluidly while this city held onto outdated structures. Creative communities that once flocked here now find more freedom elsewhere. Businesses that once insisted on being headquartered here now realize they can thrive in cities that offer stability without chaos. Even travelers seeking inspiration are discovering that the sense of discovery they used to associate with this place can be found in cities that feel more welcoming and less demanding. What unsettles many observers is not that the city is changing, but that it seems unsure of what it is changing into. The tension between preserving its legacy and adapting to new realities creates a sense of identity drift. The city tries to maintain the aura of being indispensable, but the lived experience suggests otherwise. People notice the cracks in the narrative when they encounter systems that fail, services that underperform, and environments that feel more chaotic than creative. They begin to question whether the city can still claim the role it held for so long. This is why the decline feels different now. It is not about temporary hardship or economic cycles. It is about the erosion of the meaning that once held everything together. When a city starts losing the story that defines it, the consequences ripple outward in quiet but powerful ways. People stop seeing it as the benchmark. They stop viewing it as the place where everything happens first. And eventually, without realizing it, they begin to let go of the idea that they need to experience it to understand the world. It is that shift, subtle, cumulative, and emotional, that hints at the deeper transformation underway, one that speaks not just to the present, but to the uncertain future that the city has not yet learned how to face. As the city continues to move forward without pausing to understand what is slipping away, a quiet crossroads begins to form. You can sense it not in announcements or official plans, but in the way people talk about the place, in the way they hesitate before describing it with the enthusiasm they once had, in the silence that follows questions about whether the city can recover the identity it carried for generations. What is happening now feels less like a temporary disruption and more like a deeper shift, the kind that takes shape slowly until it becomes undeniable. The tension between what the city claims to be and what people actually experience has grown so wide that something fundamental is being tested. You feel it in the way entire neighborhoods seem caught between past and future, uncertain about which direction to follow. Some areas display signs of revival, yet even there, the momentum feels fragile, as if the progress could fade with a single disruption. Other areas reveal the weight of long-term neglect, where infrastructure strains under conditions it was never meant to withstand. The pressure builds in ways that affect everyone: locals, visitors, workers, commuters, businesses, creating an atmosphere that feels both determined and fragile. The city keeps moving, but the movement feels less like ambition and more like inertia. People, watching from the outside, sense this uncertainty, even if they cannot fully articulate it. They see a place that once set global standards now struggling to meet its own expectations. They see moments of brilliance overshadowed by issues that should have been addressed years ago. They see a place that still wants to be a symbol of possibility, yet increasingly reflects the consequences of ignoring its own structural cracks. The question is no longer whether the city can reinvent itself, but whether it still possesses the stability and clarity required to attempt that reinvention. At the same time, there is an undeniable resilience woven into the environment, a strength that has always been part of the city's identity. It shows up in individuals trying to rebuild what has been lost, in communities holding on to what matters, in the small glimpses of creativity that surface even during difficult times. These moments remind people why the city mattered in the first place. But they also highlight the scale of the challenge ahead. Reinvention cannot happen through reputation alone. It requires acknowledging the reality people feel every day, and that honesty is something the city has resisted for too long. As these pressures converge, the future becomes a question suspended in the air. Not a prediction of collapse, but a recognition that something must give. A choice between continuing down a path shaped by strain or confronting the truth of how much has changed. Visitors sense this crossroads even if they cannot see its full outline. Residents feel it more deeply, aware that the story of the city is reaching a point where direction matters more than momentum. And for anyone paying attention, it becomes clear that the next chapter depends not on nostalgia, but on the willingness to face what the city has become. If you reach this point, it means the message resonated with you on some level. Leave a comment saying something like, "I stayed until the end. This message reached me, so I know you are a key with me through the entire reflection." And if this kind of deep, honest analysis matters to you, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next videos. A like helps more than you imagine, especially cuando o siento tal complexo como este. There is another video right here that expands on these ideas. Click and continue with me while we explore how modern cities shape the world we are stepping into.